I thought I was just staying the night, until my friend's sister whispered, "Come here," and everything changed. I thought it was going to be a simple night, just me crashing at my friend's place, maybe catching a movie, and grabbing a few hours of sleep before heading out in the morning. But the moment I stepped into the apartment, I realized nothing about tonight would be simple. His sister was there. I had met her a handful of times before, but tonight, there was something different. She moved with that calm, confident grace that made the room feel warmer, softer somehow. She wasn't just in the space. She filled it, in a way that made me notice the subtle details. The curve of her smile as she arranged the cushions on the couch, the way her hair caught the soft overhead light, brushing against her shoulders as she turned. She looked effortlessly put together, but there was a gentle vulnerability beneath it, like she was inviting the world in without realizing it. "Hey, come here for a second," she whispered as she handed me a folded blanket. Her voice was soft, just above the sound of my own thoughts, but it carried this magnetic pull. I walked over, and as our hands brushed while exchanging the blanket, a strange warmth surged through me. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but I noticed it. She noticed it too, I think, because her eyes flickered up to mine and lingered a beat longer than necessary. I set the blanket down, trying to shake off the sudden awareness of her presence, but it wasn't just her proximity. It was the way she existed in the space around me. Even when she moved to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water, I could still sense her. This quiet energy that made the room feel charged. I told myself I was imagining things. It had to be my mind playing tricks. But then she whispered again, this time closer, leaning slightly toward me to point something out on the coffee table. "Careful with that. It's fragile." Her breath tickled my ear, and my heart skipped, just for a moment. I cleared my throat and nodded, trying to act casual, but the awareness of her warmth, her scent, even the subtle sway of her movements, made it impossible to focus entirely on anything else. I realized she was paying attention, not in a rehearsed or showy way, but with these tiny gestures that felt intimate. A hand brushing against mine as she handed me a book, her fingers lingering just a fraction longer than necessary on the blanket, her eyes meeting mine with quiet curiosity. I couldn't tell if she intended to notice me, or if it was all accidental, but I felt it nonetheless, like electricity in the air. I was supposed to be just staying the night, but with every small movement, every whisper, every almost touch, I felt the space between just a guest and something else, something unspoken, start to shrink. The night had barely begun, and already, I knew I wasn't leaving the same person I had arrived as. Once I settled onto the couch with a blanket wrapped around me, I thought I could finally relax. But it quickly became clear that tonight wouldn't be so simple or ordinary. She was everywhere without trying to be. Not in a loud or demanding way, but in these quiet, almost imperceptible movements that made it impossible to ignore her. She was in the kitchen 1 minute, leaning slightly against the counter, pouring herself a glass of water. The next, she was rearranging books on the shelf, glancing over her shoulder with that soft, knowing smile that made me wonder if she could see exactly what I was thinking. Even when she wasn't looking at me directly, I felt her presence like a subtle current in the air, warm, inviting, slightly intoxicating. Our interactions were small, seemingly ordinary, yet they carried weight. She handed me a drink and our fingers brushed. Just a fleeting touch, but enough to make my chest tighten and my mind race. I wanted to linger, to let that contact stretch a second longer, but I pulled back, reminding myself this was my friend's sister, not a complication I was supposed to invite. Still, I couldn't deny the effect it had. She sat nearby on the couch, reading quietly, and I caught myself noticing the little things. The way her posture shifted when she was absorbed in a page, the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders as she sighed softly at something in the book, the way her hair fell across her cheek when she leaned her head in concentration. There was an intimacy in watching her exist, completely unaware that I was watching, or maybe completely aware, teasing me without saying a word. I tried to focus on a movie playing on the TV, but every glance at her pulled me back. When she laughed quietly at a scene in her book, the sound was low and melodic, wrapping around me in a way that made it impossible to hear without imagining her closer. She would occasionally reach across the couch to adjust a pillow or hand me something, and each time our fingers met briefly, the brief warmth of her touch lingered longer than it should have. There was a tension in the room, silent and unspoken, growing with each accidental brush of her hand, each lingering glance. It wasn't overt, and it didn't have to be. Its subtlety made it more dangerous, more magnetic. I was aware of her every movement, every sigh, every soft whisper, yet I couldn't make myself leave the couch or look away. By the end of the evening, I realized this night was no longer about a casual visit. The simple expectation of sleeping over had vanished. She existed in the space between us, palpable, almost tangible, and I was acutely aware of every subtle, deliberate, or perhaps accidental gesture that pulled me closer without a single word. I wasn't sure where she stood, but I was painfully aware of the way her presence had already changed everything. I came here expecting nothing, but now, even in the quiet, I knew nothing would ever be simple again. The longer I stayed, the more I realized there was a rhythm to her presence. An unspoken game, gentle but deliberate, and I was both terrified and thrilled to play along. She wasn't overtly flirtatious, not in any way that would be scandalous or inappropriate. It was subtler than that, like a breeze brushing against your skin. You felt it, shivered, and wondered if it was real. It started with teasing. I reached for the remote to rewind the movie, and she leaned over from the couch with a slight smirk. "That's not how you're supposed to watch this scene," she said softly, but the warmth in her tone made my chest tighten. She lightly nudged my shoulder with hers, and I felt the brief spark of skin-to-skin contact. I tried to focus on the TV, but the small friction lingered far longer in my mind than the scene playing out on the screen. Then there were the touches that seemed accidental or maybe not. She would pass me a snack or hand me a blanket, and our fingers would graze just enough to make me catch my breath. Sometimes, when she reached across the couch, the small gap between us shrank to almost nothing. I became acutely aware of her presence. The subtle scent of her perfume, faint and comforting. The warmth radiating from her arm brushing mine. The soft rustle of her clothes as she moved. Every movement, every glance, felt charged with potential. Her eyes were the most dangerous. They held a quiet curiosity, a knowingness that made it impossible to look away. She would catch me staring and hold my gaze for a beat longer than normal, a fleeting smile tugging at the corner of her lips, as if teasing me silently. My heart raced every time, and I found myself thinking she might be doing it on purpose. And maybe she was. Even her laughter was a tool. A soft, melodious sound that seemed to linger in the air between us, playful yet intimate. It made me aware of the space I occupied next to her, of the subtle energy humming quietly just under the surface of conversation. It was a tension that neither of us addressed directly, but that both of us felt deeply. By the end of the evening, it was impossible to ignore the line we were dancing around. Every touch, every glance, every whisper was testing boundaries. Her presence insisting on closeness, mine simultaneously resisting and yielding. I realized that this wasn't just a casual visit anymore. It was an exploration of something neither of us fully understood yet, but both of us were undeniably drawn toward. I wanted to step back and tell myself to stop overthinking it, that it was impossible to feel this way about my friend's sister, that I was imagining signals that weren't there. But I couldn't. Every playful brush of her hand, every teasing smile, every fleeting, intimate look had me suspended in a quiet, delicious tension that I wasn't ready or willing to escape. And in that tension, I knew something had already shifted. The night was no longer just about staying over. It was about the quiet, magnetic pull between us, and I had no idea how or if I was ever going to resist it. It started innocently enough, or so I told myself. A blanket that had slipped off the couch, a book that had fallen to the floor. Small excuses for us to reach across the same space. But in that tiny, shared moment, the air seemed to thicken with something neither of us could name. She bent down to pick up the book first, and I leaned over at the same time. Our knees brushed. It was just a touch, a casual contact by any normal standard, but it sent a jolt of awareness straight to my chest. We both froze for a moment, a brief laugh escaping our lips as we simultaneously pulled back, pretending the brush of skin hadn't affected us at all. Then came the blanket. She reached over to adjust it on the couch, and I instinctively moved to help. Our hands met again, lingering fractionally longer than necessary. Her fingers pressed gently against mine as if testing something, exploring an invisible line we hadn't yet named. The warmth from her skin burned through the briefest touch, and I felt my pulse accelerate. I looked up, and she was watching me with those eyes that seemed to see right through the careful masks we both wore. "I didn't mean to," I started, but she cut me off with a quiet laugh, the kind that made my chest tighten. She leaned a little closer to place the blanket properly, her shoulder brushing against mine. It was subtle, almost accidental, but the closeness left a lingering electricity in the air that neither of us ignored. Her presence felt magnetic, pulling me in even as I tried to rationalize the situation. Every small gesture, the slight shift of her body, the warmth radiating from her arm, the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the room, made it impossible to think straight. I wanted to speak, to ask if she felt it too, but words failed me. Instead, there was only the quiet tension, growing heavier with each accidental touch. She adjusted the pillow next to me, leaning so that our shoulders nearly brushed, and I caught her glance. That tiny, knowing smile tugged at me in a way I couldn't ignore. Her eyes held something unspoken, curiosity, desire, maybe just amusement, but whatever it was, it made the space between us feel electric. I realized that the night had already changed. It was no longer about casual gestures or friendly conversation. Each movement, each fleeting contact carried weight. Every shared glance, every accidental brush of hands, felt charged with intention, whether we admitted it or not. And yet, despite the tension, there was comfort in her presence. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't chaotic. It was warm, quiet, and intimate. Even as I tried to step back in my mind, my body betrayed me, leaning slightly closer, drawn toward her in a way I couldn't resist. By the end of that brief, ordinary moment, it was clear. The line between just staying the night and something far more complicated had already blurred, and neither of us seemed willing or able to step away. The evening had shifted into a quieter rhythm. The TV was background noise now, an afterthought, and the apartment seemed to shrink around the two of us, drawing us closer without any words being spoken. I had thought the accidental touches and playful proximity were enough. But now there was something heavier in the air, something charged with a tension neither of us could fully ignore. We ended up sitting closer on the couch than before. I wasn't sure if it was intentional or a slip of fate, but her shoulder grazed mine, and the warmth of her presence felt like a magnet pulling me in. She looked at me then, and for a long moment, I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't expected. Vulnerability. Not weakness, exactly, but an openness, a quiet honesty that made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt before. "I didn't think you'd notice," she whispered, almost to herself. The words were soft, delicate, and yet they carried a weight that made me sit up straighter. Her gaze held mine, searching, questioning, daring me to speak. I wanted to tell her I had noticed everything. Her subtle smiles, the way she leaned in closer when she thought I wasn't looking, the warmth that lingered every time our hands brushed, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I found myself leaning just a little closer, my shoulder barely touching hers, aware of the heat radiating from her, the scent of her perfume mingling with the faint aroma of the apartment. Every nerve in my body seemed to tingle with awareness, and my heartbeat, loud in my ears, betrayed my desire. I was terrified and exhilarated all at once, caught between what I knew was inappropriate and what felt undeniable. She noticed my hesitation. I could see it in the slight tilt of her head, the way her fingers traced idle patterns on the edge of the blanket between us. A subtle invitation that I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. And yet, I wanted to. More than anything, I wanted to close that distance, even if it was just for a second, to acknowledge the tension that had been building since I arrived. Our conversation faltered, not because we had nothing to say, but because everything felt too heavy with meaning. Every word carried subtext. Every glance hinted at desire. Every small gesture a declaration. I realized we were both testing boundaries again, but this time emotionally. We were laying ourselves bare without even realizing it, caught in a delicate balance between curiosity and caution. I wanted to ask her if she felt it too, the way I did, the quiet pull, the magnetic tension, but I swallowed the words. Instead, I simply let the moment stretch, letting our shoulders brush, letting our breaths mingle, letting the silence speak louder than any confession. And in that hesitation, in that delicate pause, I understood something. She felt it too. For the first time, the attraction wasn't accidental. It wasn't a fleeting touch or a brush of hands. It was real, and terrifying, and utterly compelling. The apartment had grown quieter, the TV long forgotten, and the soft hum of the night pressing gently against the windows. We had stopped talking about trivial things, stopped pretending the tension between us was nothing. For the first time, there was no pretense, no casual distance. Only the two of us, suspended in a moment that felt like it could stretch forever. She shifted slightly on the couch, and I instinctively moved a fraction closer. Her hand hovered near mine for just a second, then rested lightly on my arm. It was a small gesture, almost accidental, but the warmth of her touch ignited something inside me. My chest tightened, my mind spinning with possibilities I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Yet, the truth was undeniable. I didn't want her to pull away. Her eyes met mine, steady and calm, holding a question I couldn't put into words. There was no need for her to speak. The silence between us was heavy with understanding. I could feel her heartbeat through the subtle pressure of her hand against my arm, and I realized I was holding my breath, afraid that any movement might shatter the fragile balance we had reached. She leaned just slightly closer, the faintest movement, but enough to brush her shoulder against mine. The warmth of her presence was intoxicating, a gentle pull that made the world outside the apartment feel distant and irrelevant. I wanted to close the space between us entirely, to let her know, without words, that I felt the same way she did. But caution lingered. Age difference, social expectations, the fear of ruining something delicate. And yet, in that quiet moment, hesitation fell away. I reached up slowly, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, and she leaned into the touch, closing the distance with a soft, knowing smile. Her hand lingered on my arm, fingers tracing a path that was intimate but safe, deliberate yet gentle. The tension that had been building for hours found its first release, not in words, but in the simple human act of closeness. Then, as if testing the waters, she rested a brief, lingering kiss on my cheek. It was delicate, almost shy, but the weight behind it spoke volumes. It was a promise, an acknowledgement of what had been simmering between us all evening. My fingers stayed lightly pressed against hers, and I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. We didn't need to rush. We didn't need to define it immediately. The connection was enough, tangible and real in the warmth of shared space and mutual understanding. We sat together for a long while after that, words unnecessary. Every glance, every soft touch, every quiet sigh confirmed what we already knew. There was an unspoken bond, a magnetic pull neither of us could deny. It was more than attraction. It was recognition, understanding, and a slow acceptance of feelings that had been growing since I stepped into the apartment. By the end of the night, the decision was quiet but complete. We didn't need declarations or dramatic gestures. The tension had resolved into closeness, trust, and acknowledgement. The pull between us was no longer subtle. It was real, and it was ours to explore, gently, carefully, together. The night had grown still. The hum of the city outside was distant. The apartment bathed in soft, warm light, and for the first time, everything felt suspended in a quiet intimacy. After hours of subtle touches, lingering glances, and unspoken tension, the energy between us had shifted. It was no longer electric and tense. It was gentle, steady, and full of understanding. We ended up sitting close on the couch, side by side, the blanket we had shared still draped loosely over both of us. Her hand rested lightly on my arm, fingers occasionally brushing mine. A small reassurance that she was there, and that the connection we had built over the night was real. I kept glancing at her, noticing the faint smile that tugged at her lips, the way her eyes softened whenever they met mine. There was a warmth in her presence that made the world outside disappear entirely, leaving only this fragile, beautiful bubble of shared awareness. I didn't expect tonight to feel like this, I admitted quietly, my voice low, almost swallowed by the calm of the apartment. Her hand tightened slightly on my arm, a small, reassuring pressure that spoke louder than words. She leaned just a fraction closer, and I could feel the warmth of her shoulder resting near mine. That closeness carried with it a promise, a quiet acknowledgement of something neither of us could deny. She laughed softly, a sound that wrapped around me like a gentle embrace. "Neither did I," she whispered, almost shyly. But there was a certainty in her tone, a recognition that whatever had started as an ordinary evening had become something extraordinary. Her gaze held mine, steady and unflinching, and for a moment, I felt like she could see straight into the thoughts I had tried so hard to hide. My hesitation, my desire, my fear of what this could mean. We didn't need words to define what had happened. Every glance, every soft brush of fingers, every quiet moment of shared space was a declaration in itself. There was a trust here, a comfort in acknowledging our attraction without forcing it into a dramatic confession. The subtle tension of earlier had resolved into a calm, tangible closeness that felt both thrilling and safe. Eventually, the moment stretched into silence, and we simply sat there, leaning slightly toward one another, content in the quiet intimacy. Our breathing slowed, our hands remained near each other, and the weight of everything unspoken was lightened by the gentle reality of connection. It wasn't about rushing or labeling. It was about presence, awareness, and mutual understanding. As the night drew to its natural close, I realized that I wasn't just leaving the apartment with memories of flirtation or tension. I was leaving with something more profound, a bond that was real, tender, and lasting. Whether this led to something deeper, or simply remained a beautiful, fleeting connection, didn't matter. The experience itself had changed me, had made me notice the delicate power of intimacy, trust, and unspoken desire. We parted that night with a final, lingering touch, a hand pressed briefly against mine, a shared smile, a soft promise in our eyes. The air between us was calm but charged, resolved but alive. Whatever the future held, we had discovered something rare and undeniable, a connection that would linger, shape, and stay with us long after the night ended. If this story made your heart skip a beat, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another slow burn romance. Share in the comments which moment had you holding your breath. Was it the whisper, the brush of hands, or that final lingering smile? I'd love to hear your thoughts.